right, we'll go ahead and begin. So for those of you that are just logged in, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I am Eric Maribojak, the Director for the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship at George Mason University. This evening, we're having a webinar entitled, Where Are We with Blockchain Technology and Real Estate? And we have with us one of the experts in the field that hopefully we can answer some questions about this very exciting topic. So first off, for those of you that don't know us, the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship is George Mason's platform for real estate education. We have academic programs such as a master's in real estate development, and we're about to launch a minor in real estate development for our undergraduate degrees. We also have non-degree programs in executive education, as well as educational programs like the one we're having this evening. We want to thank the members of the Center's advisory board. These are the leading real estate companies in our area that provide advice, guidance, and financial support for the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship to be able to produce educational programming like the one we're having this evening. If you are interested in supporting real estate education at George Mason University, please email me at the email address that you see at the bottom of your screen. So this evening, we're going to answer the question of where are we with blockchain technology and real estate. The recent news around cryptocurrency has put blockchain technology back in the mainstream discussion. Business leaders remind us that blockchain technology today is like it was in the early days of internet technology. Blockchain may lead to faster, cheaper, safer, and more transparent real estate transactions where the traditional roles of intermediaries will be significantly changed. It has been 6 years since efforts to utilize blockchain in real estate accelerated in areas like title records and automated escrow services and smart contract technology. So where is the industry today? We're joined this evening by our featured speaker, Darwin Davishan of Vantage Legal. Darwin is the founder of Vantage Legal and is a seasoned business attorney with over 15 years of experience representing clients in a wide variety of business transactions in excess of $4 billion of transaction value. Prior to founding Vantage Legal, he was an attorney with Perkins Coie, one of the largest law firms in the country. So I will turn now the screen over to Darwin.
Thanks, Eric. Let me just share the screen here. Okay, can you see that, Eric?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Also,
okay.
Sorry, Darwin, I forgot to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to put your questions in the chat feature of right below your screen, and we will get to your questions after Darwin's presentation. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm as Eric mentioned, I'm Darwin. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm happy to be here and to talk about blockchain and real estate and where we are now that it's been several years since efforts accelerated to try to incorporate blockchain in the real estate sector, among other sectors. So here's the agenda for today real quickly. I'll just take a couple of minutes to give you a little bit of background about myself and how I came about working in this space. Then we'll talk a little bit about the basics of blockchain. Some people on this webinar may have a lot of familiarity with blockchain. Some people may not. Probably almost all of you have heard about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and others, which are virtual currencies that are essentially functioning on blockchain, but those are completely different concepts. The technology of blockchain is different from the technology of some of these cryptocurrencies, or the cryptocurrencies run on these technologies. And for purposes of real estate assets, it's important to distinguish those two. And in order for us to figure out how we can use blockchain technology and where we are now with it in the real estate sector, it's important to have a good understanding of it as a baseline. Along those lines, I'll also briefly talk about smart contracts and non-fungible tokens, which are two other important technologies, especially for real estate. Then we'll talk about public adoption, and by this I mean we will talk about what state and local jurisdictions have been doing around looking into this technology and potentially adopting this technology for use in their land records and other record systems. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the latest on that. And then we'll talk about private adoption. So what are private companies doing around taking this technology and using it in the real estate sector? So we'll talk about that as well. Just a quick note on these two bullet points. There are many state and local jurisdictions that have looked into blockchain in the context of real estate. There are also many private companies that are using blockchain in different forms that affect real estate. Obviously, this is a webinar, and we have a limited amount of time. So I won't the list of projects and jurisdictional efforts I'll talk about are certainly not exclusive. What I'm hoping to do is to show you a couple of examples of each, so that you can get a flavor of where things are with respect to both public adoption and private adoption. But certainly there are many other, there's a lot more action going on that we won't have time to talk about. And then I'll give you some conclusions, some of my own personal thoughts around where I think we're headed in this space, and then we can open it up for some questions and answers. Okay, so just a little bit about myself. I'm the founder of Vantage Legal. I started out in my career as an attorney 16 years ago, and a lot of what I did when I first started out was real estate transactional work. So I represented buyers, sellers, landlords, tenants, lenders, borrowers in real estate transactions. Mostly commercial, but then also some very high value residential as well. And that gave me a really good understanding of the process that we go through in acquiring, selling, financing, leasing real estate. And about 10 years ago, in addition to the real estate work, I also started doing a lot of technology transactional work, and did a fair amount of work in that space in different aspects of technology. And back in 2016-17, when the blockchain space really took off, when I was at Perkins Coie, I started doing work in the blockchain space, representing technology companies, including technology companies in the blockchain space that were doing work that related to real estate. Some component of it was affecting real estate in some way, the real estate industry. So I got a chance to both understand blockchain a lot better, and then also work with clients that are in that space. Perkins Coie at the time, and still is, probably one of the largest firms in the area of blockchain and virtual currency, and so that allowed us the opportunity to do a lot of work with clients in the space. Over the last few years, I've also taught a technology and real estate course at George Mason, and one of the things we talk about in that course is blockchain technology and how it impacts, what potential impacts it has on the real estate industry. So if some of my former students are on this webinar, at the end, certainly feel free to chime in with your thoughts. One of the things I found very interesting in that course was that students were very actively engaged in and very curious in discussions around blockchain. So there's definitely a lot of interest by folks around blockchain, what it can do, etc. So that's a little bit about myself. So let's start out by talking about blockchain basics, and then we'll get into some specific examples. So what is blockchain? Again, blockchain, in your minds, try to separate blockchain technology from what you see in the news, which is Bitcoin, price skyrocketing, Ethereum price skyrocketing, etc. Blockchain is a digital ledger of records that are linked, secured, and shared across many computer networks. So blockchain is basically a digital ledger, and it's a ledger of records that are shared across many computer networks. And we'll talk about each of these terms in more detail in a minute. Blockchain is distributed, it's peer-to-peer with no intermediary, or at least that's one of the big elements of it, although in some instances, particularly in real estate, you could have some sort of intermediary element to it. It's virtually immutable. We'll talk about this in more detail as well. And it has transactions that are added to the blockchain through a consensus mechanism. So this is sort of just a high-level summary of what is blockchain. So what is a distributed ledger? That's one of the key components of blockchain technology. So a distributed ledger has no central authority, and every node is responsible for maintaining the ledger. So the digital ledger that we talked about a minute ago has no central entity or authority that's managing it. So for example, if you look at these three depictions here on the far left, we have a centralized ledger. And so what this means is that the ledger is managed by a central authority, whether it be the government, whether it be a company, etc. So in the context of real estate records, the land records are managed by the county. If you have a bank account, your bank account is centralized in the sense that if it's with Wells Fargo maintains the ledger. So every time you spend money or you add money to your account, Wells Fargo conducts the debit and credit to your account, and it is in charge of managing the ledger. So each of these dots on the left in the centralized context represent, each account holders, for example. In the distributed ledger, which is on the far right, you basically have this setup where there is no central authority, where the members of that particular community are the ones that are all collectively in charge of maintaining the ledger, whatever that may be, whether that's cryptocurrency, whether that's a digital asset, but the members collectively are in charge of maintaining the ledger as opposed to one central authority. So that's the concept of a distributed ledger. So how does blockchain work? So let's just take an example here of what actually how it would work to give you a flavor of what blockchain is, and then we'll talk about use cases. So let's assume that I want to send a digital asset to somebody else. Let's say I want to send a digital asset to Eric. The digital asset, by the way, could be virtual currency. It could be Bitcoin. It could be a digital asset that represents a real asset, like real estate, for example. It could be anything that's represented in the form of a digital asset that's on a blockchain. So if I agree to send Eric my digital asset, what we would do is we would basically, that transaction would be represented online as a block, and that block would have this particular transaction with Eric and I, along with, say, a number of other transactions of other parties. And then that block is broadcast to every node, every member in the network. So in the prior slide where I showed there are nodes, there are different, the community is basically in charge. Every community member would receive a notification of a new block that has transactions in it. And the nodes are basically those members of the community in step 4 are the ones that approve that the transaction is valid. And this gets very technical and very complicated, and it's outside the scope of this conversation. But basically, you can think of it as, we make an announcement, the block is announced, the computer networks basically all go back and check to make sure that, in fact, I did send my digital asset to Eric, and in fact, all the other transactions that are on the block did actually take place. So the accounts did actually reflect the transfer. And this is what sort of mining is in Bitcoin mining and other mining. But this is where that happens. So once those transactions, once the community through a consensus mechanism confirms that indeed those transactions did take place, that I did transfer my asset to Eric and all the other ones took place, the block is then added to the chain. And so the block is then added to the chain in step 5. And what happens when it's added to the chain is that it is linked to the prior chain. This is where another technical component of blockchain comes in, which is the hashing function, which again we won't talk about. But at a high level, you can think of it as the chain is linked to the prior chain, and therefore, if one were to, because they're linked, if one were to change data in one chain, it would alter data in all the other chains because in the succeeding chains, because they're all linked. And so this is where the terminology blockchain comes in, because they're essentially linked. The chains are linked to one another. And so once this transaction takes place and it's confirmed and approved, then the digital asset transfers. So this is just a very high level overview of what a blockchain, how blockchain works. This could work in the context of, as I said, Bitcoin, or even any other type of digital asset, including real estate assets. Two more concepts to talk about here, which are important. One is smart contracts, and the other is non-fungible tokens, NFTs. On the right side here, I've added a picture of a good old-fashioned contract, the way we, a lot of us, think of a contract, which is a hard copy of an agreement that gets signed, and now a lot of it is DocuSign, but this is a good old-fashioned contract. A smart contract, in the context of blockchain, is a computer code which programmatically executes transactions in accordance with predefined terms. So it's an event-driven program that performs certain functions based on predetermined or preset instructions. So, for example, let's assume that Eric and I agree that I'm going to send him my digital asset, whether that be a real estate asset or anything else, upon the happening of a certain event. Let's say we agree that when the Dow Jones hits 35,000, I will send him that asset. So a smart contract takes technology that enables the asset that I'm going to send to be locked into the smart contract. And upon the happening of that event, whatever event we set it at, the smart contract will automatically release the asset, the digital asset, to Eric. So if you think about smart contracts, a lot of the basic sort of function of a smart contract in a code automated way is not that different from what escrow agents in real estate transactions do, which is that they facilitate the closing of transactions by following the instructions of a buyer and a seller. So if I'm a buyer, I will tell the escrow agent that we will deposit with you the money along with whatever other documents you need. We will deposit with you the purchase price and the documents. And you are to release those when the seller provides the deed, and you can record the deed among other conditions, right? And so the reverse is true for a seller. A seller likewise will deliver the deed upon instructions, with instructions not to release and record the deed until the purchase price has been sent and other conditions have been satisfied. So if you think about smart contracts, the underlying functionality of a smart contract is essentially what traditional escrow agents do in real estate transactions. And we'll talk about this later again, so you can sort of see how it ties to real estate in a more specific way. The other concept is non-fungible tokens. So non-fungible tokens basically are digital assets that represent something unique and cannot be replicated. So for example, if I have one Bitcoin and Eric has one Bitcoin, those two Bitcoins have the same value. They're interchangeable. They're worth whatever the market price is at the time. Non-fungible tokens, on the other hand, are unique in the sense that they are not equal to the next NFT. And why this is important in the context of real estate is that in real estate, just like non-fungible tokens, no two real estate assets are alike. They're all different. They're all unique. And so utilizing non-fungible tokens in the context of real estate, seems to fit just right, because real estate is also an area where every asset is unique in its own respect. So that's a quick description of those two concepts. Let's talk a little bit about what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of blockchain. So blockchain, some of the advantages, people argue that an advantage is that it's decentralized. It's a peer-to-peer network. You don't have a central authority who you have to rely upon for things, who usually charges a fee for doing whatever they're doing, right? If you have an escrow agent charge fees, title companies charge fees, they have premiums that they charge for title insurance, etc. So that's one of the advantages that folks argue that blockchain has, is that it's peer-to-peer, it's decentralized. It's immutable, and this basically goes back to the point I made earlier around the blocks being tied to one another, and it's very, very difficult, if not, it's virtually impossible, but I suppose it's doable at some point if there's some quantum computing that can do it, but it's extremely difficult to be able to change the blocks in a way that doesn't destroy, or in a way that allows the other blocks to not change as well, because they're interconnected through hashing. But the other reason why it's immutable is that, or the other reason why the immutability factor comes in, is that it is a distributed network. So every node, every member of the network has a copy of the ledger. So even if somehow if I was one of the nodes and I was able to alter my copy of the ledger that I have, the digital ledger that I have, now my copy would be inconsistent with the copy of 300 other community members out there. And so that peer-to-peer aspect of it is another thing that keeps it from not really being able to, not being able to be manipulated, where folks can change it and get away with it. The other advantage that people argue about is that it's efficient, right? I can send a digital asset a lot quicker than I can, than I can actually effectuate the transfer of real estate. It does not have an intermediary, as we said. It's digital, it's paperless. Unlike the old-fashioned contracts and other, and the old sort of the traditional way of doing it, blockchain is all digital, and it's global. So if I'm located in Europe and Eric is in the US, and we agree that Eric will send me his digital asset, it's very easy for us to complete that transaction. What are some of the disadvantages of blockchain? Let's talk about this as well a little bit. In the same way that the decentralized aspect of it is an advantage, people argue that the fact that it does not have oversight is a disadvantage, because if something goes wrong, there's nobody to look to fix. You have to look to the entire community to fix it. So there is no central authority. And in the context of, for example, land records, this becomes a real problem, because if you're if you're somebody who's contemplating using blockchain, land records serve such a critical purpose. There really ought to be somebody that, some official that can, fix problems, or somebody that we can go to if the system fails in some way. The other disadvantage that is mentioned is that sometimes it's inefficient. Blockchain is inefficient because the digital ledger is the same copy, as the identical copy of the ledger that's saved on hundreds or thousands of computers, because it's a distributed network. And so that creates inefficiencies in the sense that you need more storage space, you need more computing power. We see this in Bitcoin, for example, a lot. The mining process, which we talked about, and the computing power it takes to mine, and to update all of these thousands of nodes of the network, the ones that are on the network, they consume a lot of power, and so that makes them inefficient. I read a report recently that I think Bitcoin mining consumes more electricity than I think it was Argentina, some of the bigger countries in the world. So that's a lot of electricity consumption. So that's a disadvantage. But again, these are not things these are things that you can change when you are developing and designing a blockchain model. So these are issues that can be addressed in the development of a particular piece of software that's blockchain based. The other disadvantage is that the jurisdictional adoption issue, and the issue here is that federal, state, and local governments have been curious about this area, have been interested in researching it, but there has been jurisdictions that approach this carefully, understanding that it's a new technology. So sometimes they're a little bit suspicious about whether it'll work or not. So jurisdictions just haven't jumped on the opportunity to adopt it in their processes and in their systems. So and quite frankly, to implement laws and regulations that clarify what can and can't be done in the space, right? Aside from jurisdictions actually using blockchain, but just providing clarity to industry players on what can and can't be done within the bounds of law, because the laws are not written, they weren't written to anticipate this type of technology, this type of disruptive technology. And so laws, need to be amended, need to be updated to reflect this. Even though it's immutable, there's always the chance of blockchain being subject to a breach. So that's always something that it's never, you can never guarantee 100% that it couldn't happen, right? So that's always a concern. And then the other disadvantage that people often talk about is that it has identification concerns. Blockchain is computer code, it's software that's really based on mathematics and numbers. There are many additional layers that can get added in the use of blockchain that provide the necessary identification and resolve the identification concerns that people have. So, KYC, for example, and other types of identification mechanisms that need to be put in place so that if you're transacting on a blockchain, you want to make sure you're transacting with somebody on the other side that is not transacting with you for illegal purposes, or maybe is not on the specially designated list of the State Department, etc. So there are platforms and services that can be added on top of blockchain to address this. But blockchain in and of itself, at its core, people argue does have identification concerns because it's purely based on mathematics and numbers. So this is a high-level overview of some of the advantages and disadvantages that we see although that folks argue about in blockchain. Okay. Let's talk about public adoption now. What have states and local jurisdictions done around thinking about using blockchain technology? And specifically here, I want to talk about state and local governments looking at this in the context of adopting it as a way to maintain their land records, because I think that's where it comes up a lot. Most legislation involving blockchain and real estate to date has been exploratory in nature. So a lot of state and local jurisdictions have looked at this, have been interested in it, have commissioned agencies to look into it, which we'll talk about a little bit. But a lot of it has been exploratory in nature, in the sense that we haven't really seen a jurisdiction that says, "Oh, hey, we're going to use blockchain to replace our land record system." We haven't seen that yet. What we have seen is more exploratory and research oriented. COVID has obviously had a big impact on this. And what I mean by that is, up until 2019, 2020, we saw many jurisdictions actively looking to see how they could incorporate blockchain into their land records and other types of information processing systems that they have. And then COVID hit, right? We had the pandemic, and attention and resources were diverted from things like this, which, were put on the back burner, to things that were much more urgent, like addressing the health, the public health issues, and addressing issues around, high unemployment, et cetera. So, and tax revenues substantially were reduced. Therefore, projects like this were the ones that, the state and local governments decided, we can wait on these because we have much more pressing items to deal with. So, so in the last 12 or so months, I think COVID has had an impact from this perspective of state and local government resources to look into this more. But I do think that when COVID, finally, goes away, or at least gets to a point where we can get back to normal, you will see more and more jurisdictions revisiting this and looking into this opportunity. What I'll do is just talk about two specific states and what they've done recently before COVID hit. And there are a couple of other ones here that I've mentioned, but we'll talk about Vermont and Nevada specifically around their research on real estate and blockchain. So what has Vermont done? So Vermont, a few years ago, passed legislation that, among other things, required the government to recommend legislation to support possible use of blockchain. So what legislation did a few years ago is it commissioned the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration and other agencies collectively to really research this issue and to find out whether they could use blockchain for their official county recording system, land record system, among other record systems. And this is there was a similar study done by Cook County, but that was way back in 2015 or 2016. This is a much more recent one. And so the State Archives and Records Administration, along with the other agencies, conducted the study, and they provided a report. And the report reached certain conclusions. And the conclusions were that public records, including land records, are the crux of the public's trust in government, and they have indefinite legal and other value. So they started with that premise, the premise that our land records are critical. They're critical in the functioning of the legal system around property ownership. They're critical in the functioning of parties, both individuals and companies, having certainty around the title and ownership. So with that premise, they then talked in the report specifically about blockchain and what it can potentially do. And these are some of the conclusions that they came to. So they said blockchain does have the potential for record keeping. However, the technology for the government must be vetted thoroughly. So for government use. So this goes back to the point that it's a very new technology. It's novel. And before we start using it for critical items like land records, we need to really thoroughly vet this technology more. The other conclusion was that they can address some drawbacks, such as processing time. The other conclusion was that trustless models may not be compatible since there is no accountable party. So this is the one I mentioned earlier around, if you have a distributed network, you don't really have somebody that you can go to if something goes wrong. And do we want a record system that's like that for land records? Now you can design a blockchain platform that doesn't necessarily have a purely distributed network. Maybe it has a more limited number of nodes and players, but this was a concern that they raised. A true blockchain system that's trustless may not be compatible. Is what they said. Not enough research has been done, again, along the lines of vetting it thoroughly. And then the other two bullet points basically state that, if a state or local agency was to adopt this, they would have to undergo, significant infrastructure changes and significant changes in state laws that deal with the process of recording and asset ownership to incorporate it. So Bottom line, they did the study. They said that it's got a lot of potential, but right now it's too early for us to take it and use it for purposes of our land records. One other state I'll talk about quickly, Nevada. Nevada also had legislation a couple of years ago that, among other things, directed the governmental agencies and subdivisions to consider the use of electronic records when the agency replaces or updates an information processing system. So again, going back to this idea that, if you're going to be, let's look at this as an option. Let's examine it as an option, not necessarily definitively doing it, but let's explore it as we look to our information processing systems and we try to improve them. And the legislation also prohibits the government agencies from refusing electronic records, including blockchain, from another agency if they're only doing it because it's an electronic record. So the impact of this legislation is not that it adopts blockchain for use in land records, but that it sort of opens the door for thinking about blockchain as a potential use. So those are two examples of states that have looked into it more recently. And I think the general conclusion with state and local jurisdictions is that they're looking at it, they're interested in the idea, but we probably shouldn't expect anytime soon that states will adopt blockchain in this model as a replacement for their land records. I think that probably is an accurate statement for the near future. So if there are agents out there, on this webinar, etc., you don't have to, don't worry, you don't have to learn how to code smart contracts anytime soon, at least for now. Okay, so let's talk about private adoption. So for private adoption, I'm going to talk about two different companies and just mention what they're doing, and it'll give you a flavor of how blockchain can be used. So one of them is Fabrica, and Fabrica is a company that is digitizing ownership of land. And what does that mean? So Fabrica has developed a blockchain platform. It runs on the Ethereum blockchain, which is one of the blockchains that a lot of companies use on which to build. And essentially, what they do is they allow property owners, landowners, to convey the ownership into a trust, and then the trust is governed by a trust agreement and functions on the Fabrica platform. So, for example, if I have land and I'm interested in using the Fabrica platform, what I would do is at the county level, I would convey the land to a trust, the Fabrica trust. And so for purposes of the county's records, the trust is the owner of the land, and then the rest of the transfers subsequent to that initial adding of the property to the trust would be done at the trust level. So if I want to sell my land to Eric, I would convey to Eric my digital asset, my digital token that represents ownership in that trust. In that land. And I would assign my trustee and beneficiary interests to Eric. So essentially transactions would be, quote unquote, off chain, right? They would be off the county's chain, and it would be moved to the Fabrica chain. Not that different from limited liability companies, which you see a lot, obviously, in commercial projects, but some in residential, but not as much, where an LLC may own property. The LLC's ownership may change hands, but the LLC still owns the property, right? And so this is sort of a similar concept, but the ownership is in the form of a trust, and then the underlying trustee and the beneficiaries can change when you sell the land, but the trust remains the owner of the property. They're currently in 3 states and growing into more states. One of the things to consider here is financing considerations. They currently offer a lot of land sales are either especially in rural areas where land values are lower, a lot of land is either purchased, for cash, or it's seller financed. More often than not, that's the model, rather than getting a third party like a bank to finance it. And so this allows for this platform to work, at least in the context of land. They don't currently offer financing mechanisms where a third party like a bank would finance the transaction. And quite frankly, I don't think we're there yet in terms of the evolution and the adoption of this technology. Though I don't think we're at a point yet where third parties like banks will feel comfortable with this kind of a scenario where, if I go to a Wells Fargo and tell Wells Fargo I want to buy land, and, oh, by the way, I want to put it in the blockchain instead of county's records, they're gonna think twice about providing financing. So third-party financing is still to be determined, and it still needs to be worked through. But the reason why it works in land sales is because more often than not, land sales are seller financed. And in the context of seller financing, this is where smart contract technology actually comes into play. Because if you want to buy land on the Fabrica platform, and you want to do seller financing, the platform essentially would allow you to put the digital token that represents that asset into a smart contract. And once you've made the payments that you've agreed to make to the seller, the smart contract would then automatically release the digital token that represents ownership of that asset to the buyer. And so this is actually a really interesting way that the Fabrica is actually using smart contracts in the context of financing for real estate assets. As I said, right now their platform is limited to land sales, but depending on what happens with jurisdictional adoption in the future, and depending on what happens with third-party financing, this may be an area that where at some point in the future, parties will feel comfortable moving even beyond just land and to improve properties. That there are obviously title considerations here. So if one thing to talk about here is if you are purchasing a property on the Fabrica platform, you still need to think about title in the traditional sense, in the sense that if I'm purchasing property, I need to make sure that there are no, for example, mechanics liens on the property. And the way on this particular platform, the way that would happen is it offers you the option to and the ability to do a title search, so that you can get a title report. But title, while the title is on the platform, you still have other considerations like tax liens and mechanics liens that you still need to think about, and those are all still at the county level. And so I think that's an area where in the future, if those two are combined, then this becomes an even more powerful tool, right? If that two sets of data can be combined into one, that this becomes an even more powerful tool for purposes of transacting. So that's one example of a company that is literally now offering this a blockchain-based platform in the real estate industry. The other one I'll talk about is Ubiquity, and let me just see how we're doing on time. Okay, we're doing one on time. So this is a different model. They have an enterprise solution called Unanimity, and which is a blockchain as a service platform. And so what this does is it is an enterprise solution that county recorders offices, title companies, and other third parties can utilize to upload and maintain records on a blockchain. And this will be a sort of an off-the-shelf enterprise software that you could get to utilize to maintain your land records on the blockchain. And so, for example, if a jurisdiction in the future decides to adopt blockchain, they may look at this particular company's enterprise solution to see if that is a solution that can be leveraged for them to move to a blockchain-based platform. They are currently working with a number of title companies on the title company side. Again, on the government side, I think we're sort of at a point where we need to get back to normal on the broader economy and the pandemic, getting behind us before some of the state and local governments will look at this. But I think once all that's behind us, we will probably see a renewed interest in and considerations with respect to using an enterprise solution for record keeping. So that's the second example. Again, these are not exclusive. There are many other companies doing it, but I was hoping that I can give you a little bit of a flavor of different companies, a couple of companies that are doing it. So conclusions. What are some of the conclusions we can draw from these? And these are just my own personal conclusions in looking into this and being involved in this sector. It is, in my personal opinion, it is not likely that jurisdictions will adopt blockchain technology in the sense that we know it, right? In the sense that it does not have a central authority and that it's distributed. They will not adopt blockchain to replace their existing transaction records and systems. So it's too early, I think, for governments, state and local governments, to start to feel comfortable around using this technology. It's still very early. It's only been around for 10 years. It's too novel. And the recording system is too mission critical for, I think, local governments to contemplate using them, despite the fact that it may bring some benefits. I think it's too critical for them to utilize before there's more research done and more feasibility done around the effectiveness of the technology. So my personal view is that I don't think that in the near future you're going to see counties and states adopting the blockchain as a formal sort of a recording system for land records or other records. What is more likely to happen is that businesses will continue to leverage blockchain in the real estate industry to improve processes and solve problems, right? Address pain points. So we've seen two examples of companies that are utilizing blockchain in different ways. And so I think what we will see is continued effort from the private sector to utilize blockchain in ways that solve pain points in the real estate industry and address issues. And that will probably be separate and independent from what the state and local governments do around adoption of blockchain. But certainly on the private side, I think we'll see renewed efforts or continued efforts to utilize blockchain in different ways. So those are my conclusions, and I think that's it. So thank you for listening in. Eric, I'll turn it over to you to see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Darwin. So please put in your questions in the Q&A. Apologies, it's not the chat. Use the Q&A if you have any questions. We'll start off with a couple from the audience. First one is, I'm in the real estate rental housing industry. Can rental payment be an option for blockchain or cryptocurrencies? What would be the benefits of doing that for apartment community payments?
Yeah, I think rental payments can be an area where you could utilize virtual currency. But this gets to the at the beginning I sort of tried to talk about how virtual currency, cryptocurrency, and blockchain are two different things. So blockchain technology can be used for a number of different ways that we talked about. But then there's this other piece of it, right, which is the virtual currency, which is the cryptocurrency, and these are methods of payments. These are virtual currencies that have value. So if you are an owner of multifamily projects, can you accept virtual currency? What are the benefits? I think the benefits are that it gives your customers, your tenants, another form or another method, another form of payment. There is something like $1.5 trillion worth of value now in these currencies. So there's a whole pot of money there that can be utilized by individuals to pay for things. It could be Bitcoin, it could be Ethereum, it could be other digital assets of value. So I think the benefit probably is that it will give your customers another means by which to make rent payments. One other point to make about cost here, when Bitcoin first started, it was a peer-to-peer network, and one of the things that was talked about a lot was that you get rid of the intermediary, right? So and that reduces costs. Practically speaking, I think what you're going to see is that if you're an apartment owner and you want to accept cryptocurrency, it gives your tenants another way to pay. But it's not going to be free, right? You're still going to have to go through a processor to accept payments in a way that allows your tenants to pay you. Short of tenants and landlords having private addresses, which probably isn't practical. And so there will be costs associated with getting rent payments through this method, but it will give your tenants another means by which to make rent payments.
I guess the flip side of that, Darwin, Elon Musk accepted Bitcoin for Teslas comes to mind. If apartment communities start accepting payment, or any other landlord starts accepting payment in that, what can they do with the payment they get? Maybe as the flip side.
Yeah, well, I think what they can do is they can liquidate it if they can convert it to dollars if they would like. They can do what Elon Musk said, which is that they're just going to hold it in Bitcoin. If you accept Bitcoin, but you can either convert it into cash, or you can hold it, or you can convert it into some other type of cryptocurrency. So, for example, you may get Bitcoin, but you really want to have Ethereum, whatever the case is. So you have options there to either convert it to cash or hold it.
Okay. Next question. So in your chart of a digital asset from A going to party B, question is, does B have to be within the blockchain network or community to receive the transfer of the digital asset?
Yes, typically you would both be members of the community, and what you basically would need to have is a private key, and this is where it sort of gets technical. But if you have a private key and a public address, you would be able to receive the digital asset. Now that's different from the nodes, right? The nodes are the ones that are basically in charge of keeping the ledger and managing and confirming these transactions before they get added to the block. But if you have a public address, you would be able to receive payments.
Okay. The next question, this pertains to, I think, the Fabrica example that you explained. Mm-hmm. How is it handled when a property gets subdivided? Say a land property gets subdivided on the Fabrica model.
So I don't know that they have that functionality yet. But in thinking out loud about this, I suppose I'm not sure. The platform itself doesn't allow for it yet now, I don't think. But I suppose what you could do is, if you have a large tract of land that's 20 acres and you want to subdivide it into 10 lots, right? You could take it out of that. Once the subdivision is complete, you could take it out of that trust that holds the trust that is for the entire 20 acres, and you could put it into 20 trusts, that each of which represent ownership in one specific property, tax parcel. So the platform, as designed now, I don't think accommodates subdivisions, but in thinking about it, it's probably not that hard to take it out of the platform and put it back in as subdivided, or some other way that you could potentially do it.
Next question is, where do you see non-fungible tokens, I guess in the context of a real estate use, is going in the near future?
Yeah, I think we'll see it being used as companies try to leverage just blockchain overall in real estate asset ownership. I think the reason non-fungible tokens are interesting is because they have some unique aspects to them, just like real estate does. And I actually think that to a large extent, even the Fabrica tokens are are NFTs in the sense that they represent ownership in a particular asset that's different from every other land asset. But I think that as we talk about blockchain and its use for land ownership, it seems like it seems an obvious thing to use NFTs because they're going to be unique in the same way that land is unique.
Next question. So this is from a real estate broker. In the event that a purchaser wants to pay with Bitcoin and the seller needs physical money, I guess dollars, to transfer to the seller the new house, and the seller is not going to accept Bitcoin as a method of payment, how would that work? I guess is the question. What kind of process? Is there an intermediary that would do the exchange, the changing from Bitcoin to dollars? Is it kind of how you would work out the two methodologies for that to work?
Yeah. So I mean, one thing that the purchaser could do is liquidate the Bitcoin. Let's say they're trying to use Bitcoin. They could liquidate it on their end and utilize the cash. They may not, I guess for tax and other purposes. I don't know. I'm trying to think of what the reasons would be for them to not want to do that. Maybe there are reasons that they may not want to liquidate the asset before they make the purchase. And there are service providers, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there are service providers out there that would allow for you to exchange, to be sort of the middleman that could take the Bitcoin and convert it to dollars. So I mean, it is something that's doable, whether it's through an intermediary or whether it's just through the buyer liquidating its Bitcoin and just using cash from the proceeds of the sale of Bitcoin.
So just like any foreign currency exchange at the airport, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a question to that. So I think for the first time this year, the IRS is asking for information about ownership of cryptocurrency now in our tax returns. So a lot of that I certainly was surprised to see that question this year. Can you speak a little bit about that? If somebody does want to liquidate Bitcoin to pay for a house, are there now federal or state taxation aspects that we have to think about as real estate purchasers and sellers? Yeah,
absolutely. And there are. I'm not a tax lawyer, but when you liquidate Bitcoin, you're basically selling an asset, just like you would sell any other asset. And the sale of an asset is viewed as a taxable event, right? And so you can't do a 1031 using Bitcoin for real estate, right? So you can't 1031 your Bitcoin sale into a real estate asset. It doesn't work. It's not allowed. And so yes, if you liquidate your Bitcoin to purchase real estate, there will be potentially taxable consequences both at the federal level and at the state and local level, depending on your specific jurisdiction and what sort of tax structures they have in place.
Okay. There's a question here about the definition of a distributed system. So how does the distributed system make money or what motivates the people in the system to maintain the ledgers?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So what motivates them is compensation for doing the complicated work of confirming those transactions that we talked about at a high level. And this is where the mining, concept comes in. So if you mine Bitcoin, essentially what you're doing is, again, at a very high level, you're confirming, that the transactions took place, and there's a lot of complicated, math behind it as well, and technicalities behind it. But you do get compensated for doing that work. Different blockchains have different structures in place, but obviously one of the things that has to take place is motivation for the network operators to maintain the ledger, otherwise it loses its integrity. And the way that you incentivize them is by rewarding them with something of value. And in the case of Bitcoin, you get rewarded with more Bitcoin. And in other blockchains, you could design it differently. You could design it so that the reward is something other than the native currency.
Related to that, you had mentioned there's different, Ethereum you had mentioned as a kind of blockchain. How do you choose which blockchain to work with, say in the real estate environment, if you're considering that?
Yeah, so Ethereum it's probably one of the top blockchain platforms that companies take and utilize to build specific blockchains for specific purposes. But there are many others. R3 is a company based out of New York, and they have their own blockchain platform that you can take and utilize, for your particular needs. And there are others out there. I think probably what each company has to do is, through engineers and technical analysis, figure out which one, is the right fit for them, depending on what they're looking for and what functionality each particular blockchain has. So, some may have certain advantages and others may have other advantages. And I think, from a technical overview standpoint, you probably want to look at it, each of them, and figure out which one makes sense to use for your particular purposes.
Next question is, so once a blockchain software program has been created, do the creators step aside and are no longer able to alter the software in any way?
Yeah.
And how do programs correct errors in the software itself?
So in the case of, yes, well, I guess it depends. It depends on the specific type of blockchain. You can design it to be really any way that you would like it to be, right? So you could have a method in which there continues to be somebody who can make modifications to the blockchain to address bugs and others, or you could just have the community collectively work on fixing bugs and fixing problems within the blockchain that's been designed. But I think one of the good things with this technology is that I think you can really customize it to fit your particular needs. So, for example, in the example of real estate land records, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which you just hand it off to the community, right, and just let the community manage it. Land records serve such an important purpose that no matter how you adopt it at the county, at the state and county level, you probably want somebody at the end of the day to be accountable for fixing bugs and addressing other problems that come up. But I think the short answer is you can design it in different ways.
Next question is on the Fabrica example you gave. What happens if a buyer defaults on payment obligations in a seller finance transaction? Do the smart contracts execute certain things? If there's occupancy on the property, I guess we're talking about land, but if there's some sort of occupancy on the property, does the Fabrica platform deal with that as well?
Yeah, so my understanding is that at this point, the initial thing that happens or that doesn't happen is that the smart contract does not send the digital asset, right? If the payments are not made, the smart contract does not send the digital asset to the buyer. Beyond that, obviously in the traditional model, you've got a whole foreclosure process, right? You've got a trustee sale. You've got all of that processes, those processes that are already in place. My sense is that at this point, I don't know how much detail there is on that, other than perhaps the title doesn't transfer, and maybe there's some sort of a mechanism for either for Fabrica as the platform to get involved to try to resolve the dispute, or for the smart contract to just send it back, send the token back to the original owner, because the conditions in the escrow, the conditions in the smart contract were not satisfied. But these are great questions and interesting questions that require that sort of highlight the complexities around thinking about using blockchain for a unique asset class like real estate and land records and all of the issues that are associated with it.
So you talk a little bit about state involvements in blockchain. What role should the federal government have in expanding or evaluating the use of blockchain in a space like real estate?
So I think in the context of real estate, a lot of what happens with real estate records is state and local. The federal government, obviously, there are many other areas that come into play when we talk about blockchain that are at the federal level, and specifically cryptocurrencies, right? You've got SEC issues, you've got commodities law issues, you've got FinCEN issues, KYC, AML issues. There are all sorts of at the federal level issues that need to be. There's money transmission issues that sometimes come into play that need to be addressed. But with respect to real estate, I think a lot of it is probably local, in the sense that if you're a state or a county that wants to utilize blockchain for your recording system or for some sort of a record system, that you probably have the freedom to do that. So long as you've done appropriate, homework to make sure that it's going to be an effective system that actually works. At the real estate level, at the real estate, I should say, land records level, I don't know to what extent it would be helpful or useful for the federal government to be involved.
Yeah. So what about at a national level? I know there's been countries which maintain national land records that have sort of experimented with blockchain. I think in my reading, Sweden or the United Arab Emirates or some of the other countries that maintain land records on a national level instead of a local level have been experimenting with blockchain. Can you speak a little bit about that experience and any lessons applicable to the United States?
Yeah, I have heard of a number of countries that have looked to adopt it. Every land record system in every country is so different that I can't think off the top of my head a specific lesson that's learned somewhere that can be utilized here or vice versa. I think what's important is to probably consider each particular jurisdiction's specific needs and processes around what their land record system looks like, and addressing the needs that come into play in that specific jurisdiction. So, for example, I've heard of Brazil being another place that has at least looked at this. I don't know to what extent they may have issues that are unique in that country that we don't necessarily address. For example, their loan default and foreclosure process may be different. Their mechanics lien process may be different. Their deed recording systems may be different. And so I don't know that there are sort of high-level lessons learned everywhere that can be applied. I think it's more of a state, a more jurisdictional local issue that you have to take into account considering the specific processes of each country and each state and locality.
So you had mentioned on one slide that the private sector, rather than the public sector, will likely continue to leverage blockchain technology to improve processes and solve problems. So other than the two examples you have, can you elaborate on maybe a couple of other private sector initiatives or endeavors or pilots that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, there's another company called Propi that also has been in this space, and they started, I think, back in 2017. Their platform is more around, I think, more around transaction management, residential property purchase and sale transaction management, if I'm remembering correctly. So that's one. And then there are others that I can't remember specific names at this point, but there are other companies that, there are companies, for example, that are looking at fractional ownership of assets, right? So taking a particular commercial asset, for example, and fractionalizing and selling fractions of the commercial asset on the blockchain. So there are different examples that there are different ways in which private parties have been able to use, or have tried to use this technology. But Propi is probably one that comes to mind as another quick one especially for residential transactions. But there are many others as well.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank Darvin for his time and expertise this evening. It's definitely a very interesting and really complicated process that we're going to keep on top of and see where we are. We first had a blockchain event probably 4 years ago, so now we're kind of updating our knowledge of where we are, and hopefully in a couple of years we'll have another update to find out what people are doing with blockchain technology. So again, thank you, Darvin, for your time this evening.
Well, thank you, Eric, for having me. It was a pleasure to present this. And if anybody has any questions or wants to talk about this topic further, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to chat about it further. As Eric, you pointed out, I think this is an area that will continue to evolve, and we'll continue to see developments in this space. I think what 2016 and 2017 looked like, it feels like a lifetime ago when you look at those years for blockchain versus just 5 years later. And I think we will continue to see, a lot of evolution and change in the space. So yes, there will definitely, in a few years, the landscape may look totally different in a few years. And I'm, happy to talk about this further if anybody has any additional questions or wants to chat about it further.
All right. The event tonight has been recorded, and we will be sharing a link on the recording probably by tomorrow. Just a few announcements from our part. We're accepting applications now for our fall 2021 class for our MS in Real Estate Development program. We're also having a webinar next month on April 29th called The History of Zoning and Segregation in Virginia, Lessons for Today. If you'd like to register for that webinar on April 29th, please send me an email at my email there on the screen. And so with that, we'd like again to thank Darvin for sharing his expertise and time this evening. I'd like to thank all of you who joined us this evening. Thank you very much for your interest in real estate education at George Mason University. And we hope to see you at a future George Mason Real Estate Education program. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you all.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you.